Good day, good day. I hope you're doing well. We are in day 24 of our Bible reading where we've looked at Exodus 19, 20, and 21. I'll be giving lessons from this, starting with a high level overview of what is going on. Now, what we saw in the previous chapter is that the Israelites were in a place called the wilderness of sin. I did mention that the word sin there is just a name of a place, it has nothing to do with disobedience or wrongdoing. However, what we saw is that the wilderness of sin was described to be in between Elim and Sinai. Already, this gives us an idea, even from the previous chapter, that they were headed to Sinai. Why? Because the previous chapters before it had mentioned that they were coming from Elim. So, if they were coming from Elim and now they're in between Elim and Sinai, it means that they're probably heading to Sinai. In fact, that is exactly what is happening in chapter 19. We see that they're now in Sinai, where there's a mountain. This mountain is also known as Mount Sinai. So Moses is called up to the mountain by God for God to give Moses the law. But what chapter 19 is doing, it is giving us the environment, it is giving us the context, it is giving us the feel of how it was like, how things were when the law was given, meaning that when the people observe and they remember the day in which the law was given, what are they going to remember? They're going to remember a day where there was an awesome presence of God. They're going to remember thunder and lightning. They're going to remember fire and smoke. So there's a sense of glory taking place here. There's a sense of a wonderful and awesome environment wherein God and His glory and His holiness is descending, is coming in power and glory. In fact, it's so scary that the people are not even allowed to get close to the mountain. They set a boundary. There's thunder, there's lightning. So when this law is given, even though it is called the law of Moses, based on the environment that we're reading in chapter 19, one can say that no, this is the law of God. Because what happened that day, that was not just something which Moses made up. Moses did not just come to the people and say, guys, here's the law. From today onwards, we're going to live like this. The people would have seen that there was something extraordinary that took place, and therefore we can even call this thing the law of God, not just the law of Moses. So that is chapter 19. It is giving us the environment or the context, the feel of how things were when the law was given. And then chapter 20 begins to give the law, starting with the 10 commandments. So chapter 20 is where we find the 10 commandments, which are very popular and well known by most people. However, in these 10 commandments, most would see them as a base or a foundational law through which the rest of the other laws, the rest of the various laws which are given, may relate to the 10 commandments. Probably not all of them, but most of them would relate to the 10 commandments in one shape or the other. I mean, especially when you look at the very first commandment, which says you should have no other gods besides me, meaning that when you look into most of the laws, they'll speak things which are against idolatry, against worship of other gods, right? Honoring father and mother, loving one another. We can see how when we honor father and mother, there's some certain things in the rest of the law that you would not do. Being of those who love one another can definitely be summed. In fact, even in the New Testament, we see this, that the whole law can be summed up in the idea of love. So what we see with the Ten Commandments, at least for the most part, it's a foundational law, and then we're going to continue hearing more and more law. So what's happening in chapter 20 is that there's the Ten Commandments, but it did not end at the Ten Commandments. Because when we speak about the law, and even when you read in the New Testament, when it speaks about the law, it is not talking about the Ten Commandments, it is talking about the whole law. So it is more than 10, but the 10 are foundational, right? And then it does continue. It does continue. Even from Exodus chapter 20, we see a continuation where it lists more additional law. And then chapter 21 also gives us additional law. So what's happening is that Exodus 19 gave the environment. Exodus 20 and 21 is giving us the law. In chapter 21, in the beginning, we see there the law pertaining to slavery, how to handle your slave. And that's for some people, they get frightened by that, like, hey, hang on, why is God giving people the law of how to handle slaves? Should people even have slaves? But we need to be reminded of the fact that the slavery in the biblical days is not much the same as the slavery of the recent past years, because it's not based on a race, so it's not a racism issue. It was based on economic situations where sometimes someone who is free, a person who's free, can go to someone and say, "May I please be your slave? May I please be your servant? May I serve you so that I can have food?" We saw this example in Genesis towards the end when Joseph was ruling in Egypt, and the Egyptians came to him saying that, "We want to offer ourselves to you because we do not have anywhere else to go." And then in that way, the Bible described how the land, and the people became even more fully under Pharaoh, because Joseph had purchased these people to be able to give them food, to be able to give them grain. And this is some of the ways in which people went into slavery. It was not based on race, number one, and number two, it was not based on people being kidnapped. In fact, we're going to read a verse here which I've highlighted, which speaks against kidnapping and selling. In fact, it even says that whoever is found in possession, you might not have kidnapped, you might not have sold, but because you bought, even you who bought, you are in trouble before the Lord. Meaning, God is against the idea of even the person who bought. And I think there's something powerful about that, because one of the ways in which you can stop certain types of crime is when you stop the people who are buying. Because when certain crimes continue, is because there's people who continue wanting to buy those things. A good example to give is when people want to buy their car parts in some areas, and those car parts were stolen, or they're coming from stolen cars. So the reason that people will continue stealing cars is because people want to continue buying things which are not approved, or things which are behind the corners. So when we continue buying and supporting certain activities, then those activities will continue to exist, right? And therefore, people's cars will continue to be stolen. So it's quite interesting that right from the law of God, there's already a punishment that can be given to the person who bought, not necessarily the person who sold. But of course, even the person who sold will be in trouble, in as much as the person who bought. Okay, so that's what we're seeing in the three chapters. So one can actually summarize them in one or two sentences and simply say that Exodus chapter 19 gives us the environment in which the law was given. Exodus chapter 20 begins God speaking the law, and then chapter 21 is a continuation of the law being given. All right, now let's go into some of the verses that I've highlighted, and we can have lessons from them. So in chapter 19, I've highlighted verse 4, which says, "You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself." Right? So this is God speaking about himself, saying that they have seen, right? In fact, when we read it, um, clearly it is showing us that there's something that happened in Egypt. Because these people, they were in Egypt, and there were all the 10 plagues, all those, God showing his mighty strong hand. "You have seen what I did to the Egyptians." So that's what it means. And then, "how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself." So the reason I highlight this verse is because it reminded me of salvation. Remember that these people were slaves in Egypt, just like we may begin as slaves to sin, right? And then God comes and he does what? He does mighty works. He he does mighty works in his what? In his power. So those were the mighty works we saw in Egypt, and in particular, the last plague being important because there was a Passover. And for us, the mighty work, which is like the Passover, is where there's the death of Jesus. That is the mighty work. Or there's the death of Jesus on the cross, right? And after this death of the firstborns, it is then where a way is finally made. Pharaoh says, "Okay, these people must go." In fact, they chased them out. That's how much of a clean way was made. Imagine you make a way. God makes a way where there seems to be no ways. You make a way. He's a way maker. He makes a way that the people who are going, they are going in a hurry. So much so that when they remember this day, they must eat food in a hurry. Why are they eating food in a hurry? Because they are remembering that when they left Egypt, they left in a hurry. Why did they leave in a hurry? Not because they were afraid, but because they were being chased out, because the Egyptians were afraid, right? The Egyptians were like, no, we're letting you go. We can't have you here, or else we'll be in bigger trouble, right? So God says that He has brought them to Himself. So I compare this with salvation. Why? Because even for us, He's the one who brings us to Himself. He brings us to Himself. Just as He made a mighty work of the cross, and that mighty work of the cross made a way, right? It made a way for us to be able to come to Him, but He brings us to Himself. I brought you to myself, it says. So He brings us to Himself. So what I'm trying to show here is that a big part of salvation is God working in us, is God drawing us to Himself. He draws us to Himself. But this does not mean that because it is God doing the drawing to Himself, He brought us to Himself, this does not mean that there's no responsibility on our part. No. In fact, we can even see with the Israelites that even though God brought them to Himself, they still continued to disappoint Him. They still continued to sin. They still continued to be complaining there in the wilderness. So they did not obey Him. They did not do their part, even though God had done His part. So I'm trying to show us that, yes, salvation for the most part, in fact, we can say a big part of salvation, or the whole of salvation, is like it's God. But they had the responsibility. They had to walk, right? Imagine if uh, they're being released from Egypt, but they are not walking. They refuse to walk and they still sit. Then they will die, right? Imagine if they did not obey and they do not put the Passover blood on the doorpost, then they will die. Or they just sit instead of walking. They had to walk. They had to walk through the dry land of the Red. They had to walk through the sea, right? So they had some action to do, but when they look back, they can't credit themselves that, yeah, we are saved because we know how to walk. I mean, the big work here was the hand of God. It was God who did it all. It was God who brought them to Himself. In fact, I've highlighted verse 5 to show this point. Because verse 5 says, now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant. So I like this verse because it's showing us that, yes, God does the bringing us to Him, but He still says, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant. There is a part that people must do. They must obey. They must obey and keep the covenant. So, yes, God brings us to Himself, but we should walk faithfully before Him. All right, let's move. So I'm going to go to the next chapter 20, where we have the 10 commandments. So, with the 10 commandments, we need to remember that the commandments have, no, not the commandments, the law of Moses in general can be categorized, and it's not always good to categorize them, because when God gives these commandments, or when God gives these laws, then they're not, He doesn't categorize them, say, here's the law for what is the, no, He just mixes them all together. That's the first thing you must be aware of, that the law of God is given up, mixed together, because life is all united into one thing. God doesn't want you to have Sunday life and Monday life. It's okay, I'll give you the law for Sunday, and then Monday to Saturday you can live. No, no. He gave the law mixed up together, meaning that He sees these things, they are all intertwined, interrelated. So, in as much as we can categorize the laws and say that there is the moral law, there is the ceremonial law. So, ceremonial law has to do with the law pertaining to how they must conduct their ceremonies, especially when they are in the presence of God, there in the tabernacle and later in the temple, right? So it's the ceremonies of how the priests should conduct their ceremonies. It was a law, right? And that's not a law that you can obey today because, first of all, you're not a priest. Secondly, you don't have the temple. You're not in Israel. So, unless you're these things, because you need to be in the land, number one, you need to be a priest for some of them, and you need to have a tabernacle or a temple where God is going to be located. So we can begin to need to just take the principles out of some of the laws without wanting to obey them. In fact, the more we read, you're gonna see that if you find someone who decides to say, okay, for the next 6 months, I want to do everything which is written here and practice it, guess what? You're gonna run away from that person. You'll think that person is something else because they're cutting animals, they're sprinkling blood. We're gonna read about it soon. They're gonna be doing all of those things, right? So there's the ceremony law. It has to do with how the priests should conduct these religious things. But those things doesn't necessarily mean that when we're supposed to do them today. No, no, no. We need to understand it that it is pertaining a temple, it is pertaining a people who are located in a place. Okay? And number three, there's the civil law. So civil law has to do with how to live with each other. You can have laws in your community where you live that we're not allowed to do loud music, to play loud music, or like it's how civil people who are living close to each other can have a law to 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 rule over the affairs of the community to ensure that this community can be a peaceful community. So there's something that we call civil law, and civil law has nothing to do with whether you're a bad person or a good person, at least for the most part. You know, your sometimes the inability to follow the rules of your community just makes you look like a bad person. But for the most part, the civil law does not necessarily fundamentally point to holiness or purity or morality. It's not a moral issue. There's some law which are not a moral issue. Okay? And lastly, there is now the moral law, right? Where it's about good and bad. It's a moral issue. Being murder, that's a moral issue. Adultery, that's a moral issue. So there's some things which have to do with morality, and there's some things which have to do with their ceremonies and civil. But here's the issue. The issue is that sometimes all of this law is mixed up together, and it makes people, uh, it's hard to divide it because at the end of the day, it's one law, right? So at least for the Israelites, they needed to follow this thing to the dot. They needed to follow it to the dot. But why do I go in length trying to mention all of these things? Because when you read then the Ten Commandments, one of the things that people have a difficulty with the law of Sabbath day is because it is contained in the Ten Commandments, and people want to live under the Ten Commandments because the Ten Commandments just look nice. I mean, obey father and mother, do not kill, do not commit adultery. All of those things are things we live under. So people will make an argument that how is it that you have 10 commandments and you just take away one and remove it? But actually, the right perspective to understand these things is that you have over 600 law, and all 600 law have been fulfilled in Christ Jesus, and then he gives us a new law, and it just so happens that in the new law some of the laws will be repeated, including the Ten Commandments, however not the Sabbath one. So when you begin to understand it that way, then you can say the following statement which can confuse people. You can say the statement that I do not live under the Ten Commandments. I do not need to live under the Ten Commandments. I live under, and the reason I don't live under the Ten Commandments is because I do not live under the law of the Old Testament or the law of Moses, right? Because it was a covenant being given to these specific people. It was not given to us, the Gentiles. So we do not live under the 10 commandments because we do not live under all 600 laws altogether. However, we live under the new covenant, and the new covenant will still contain within it the law from the 10 commandments, the laws from the 600 plus laws, not just the 10, but of the 600 plus, it will contain parts of them, most of, especially when it has to do with moral issues, right? The laws like against some sexual practices, the laws of murder and all of that. Like we can clearly see that these things can easily find translation. All right, so, but then if I go into the 10 commandments, the one commandment that I really pause and highlight is the very first one. I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. It's a very foundational law. And when you consider all the other law, this is the foundational law. Because most things that we do is because we consider them idols, right? And verse 5, which I've highlighted, says, you shall not bow down to them, to the carved images or anything. You shall not bow down to them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. Right? So here we are hearing that we should not bow down to idols. Now, the reason I highlight this thing is because nowadays there's now this thing where people worship men of God. They see men of God as idols. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. We see in the New Testament how some of the angels, even when John bowed before them, they say, get up, you and I are both servants. The likes of Peter, when he goes in Acts chapter 10 to visit the house of Cornelius, Cornelius bows down, but Peter says, no, get up, I'm a man. Why? Because they identified this law, that you shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. So there's a problem we have today with men of God becoming like a deputy God, and people want to bow down before them. Jesus says that only one is your Father, the one in heaven. You can read Matthew chapter 23. All right, so I've highlighted verse 20 as well, which says, do not fear, for God has come to you to test you, that the fear of God may be before you, that you may not sin. And what we see above it is that there was thunder and flashes of lightning. And the reason I highlight that verse is to show us once again, as a reminder, the context of how this law was given. And the context was that there was an awesome environment that people were afraid. But look at it, that you may not sin. So just a reminder that the context was so that people can be aware that this law is the law of God. It's not just the law of Moses, right? All right, so the last verse I'll speak about in chapter 20 is verse 25, which says that you shall make me an altar if you shall make an altar of stone. If you shall make an altar of stone, you shall not build it of hewn stones, for if you wield your tool on it, you will profane it, right? So what the law is saying here, what God is saying is that if people are making an altar of stone, do not build it of hewn stones. For if you wield a tool, remember we connected right in the Ten Commandments, because in the Ten Commandments says, do not make an image, right? Do not use a tool to craft an idol. So it means that here they're saying, if you build an altar, don't use a tool, don't use it of hewn stones, for you will profane it, right? So what it means is that if you're building an altar made of stone, just take the stones as they are. Don't try and use a tool to hewn the stones, meaning that to shape them nicely so that it becomes a beautiful altar, because the beautiful one is God. And here's the issue. You can create a beautiful altar, then the altar becomes the God, then the altar becomes the idol. So the idea here is to always point people to God, to say that don't look at the beautiful altar, look at the beautiful God. So it's quite interesting that the same thing that was being created to bring sacrifices to God, to worship God, to be a contact point for God, the same thing can become a stumbling block. The same thing can become the reason people are actually worshiping it. And in fact, we can see this applicable as a principle within churches, wherein, we could now put decorations. We don't need a church. We can put all the hype. And of course, we do want our church spaces to look nice and beautiful, but we need to be careful that these things we're doing, they themselves do not become the center of attraction, because the only center of attraction which should exist is God. Right? So we must be careful of how much emphasis do we put in these things to make things nice, as opposed to focusing on God, so that people are not distracted. Sometimes people can be distracted by looking at the things happening in church, happening at the front, because you do all of this nice what, but now people are not focusing on God. All right, let me move to the chapter 21 and just highlight a few verses. So the first verse is verse 9, which says, if it designates um, uh, if it designates her for his son, he shall deal with her as with a daughter. So what's happening here is that he's talking about slavery. In fact, from verse 1, it has been talking about slavery in terms of laws on how to treat the slaves. But one thing which is clear, you can see that there's a trend that they must be treated nicely. I mean, the other verse which I did highlight is verse 2, which says, if you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve you 6 years, and in the 7th year you shall let him go for free, right? So what we can clearly see is that even though slavery might be taking place, there's a sense of they must be treated properly. They must be treated well. And in fact, there's something positive when you read this passage. There's something that feels positive. Of course, you can connect it with what I've said earlier in the introduction about the kind of slavery which existed here. Verse 9, which says, if he designates her to a son, is speaking about if the slave is a woman, to say that, okay, if you have a woman slave and you give her to your son, then you must deal with her as a daughter, meaning that she's actually being honored. She's being treated as a wife, right? She's being treated as a wife. So I found that to be quite interesting. But let me move. So this verse 15 and 17, which I've highlighted, which says, verse 15 says, whoever strikes his father or mother shall be put to death. Verse 17, whoever curses his father or his mother shall be put to death. And the reason I highlight this verse is to show that actually God cares about parents, that parents should be honored. We see this in the Ten Commandments as well. And then when people come against God, saying that God doesn't care about our parents, He doesn't care about our culture, He doesn't want us to do ancestral worship, Christianity doesn't support ancestral. But what about these verses which show that we must honor father and mother? We show that even if you curse your father or mother, you will be put to death. It clearly shows that from the very beginning, God had intended that parents must be honored. They must be honored and respected, so much so that if people curse them, they must be put to death. Now, I've highlighted verse 16 as well to remind us about the nature of slavery, and that actually the Bible does condemn stealing people. In fact, I spoke about this a lot in my introduction. Verse 16 says, whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him shall be put to death. So the one who's buying is being put to death, because you are in possession of someone you're not supposed to be in possession with. If anyone steals a man and sells him. So that alone can show us that the Bible does not support buying or stealing people, kidnapping, and selling them. So the slavery of the more recent days. All right, let me finish up with the last verse, which is verse 24. In fact, it's part of a bigger verse. When you start it from verse 23, it says, but if there is harm, then you shall pay life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, and for hand, foot for foot. And what I find interesting about this verse is the justice system of God. That the justice system of God is perfect. He wants things to be paid like for like, eye for eye. In fact, I would even say that the seeing eye for the seeing eye. If someone else has a blind eye, we can't replace it with the seeing eye. You must take out their their seeing eye as well. What this shows is that God has a perfect justice system, and in this way, it must be that the Adam who sinned was before he sinned, he was sinless, he was without blemish or spot. Therefore, if we're saying an eye for an eye, we need an equal replacement, which must be a man without any sin. And this goes to show us that Jesus is the only way out. The only way out was that a man with no sin, a man with no blemish or spot, should die for all of us. Amen.